no matter who you are, where you are, what your choices have been, and what karmic timelines and contracts you have journeyed, the light is calling for the reunification of all aspects of life in this realm now. It is calling for the cleansing of all polarities. It is calling for the rising of all sacred heart centers now. All are being summoned home to the greater light now.
Hi, and welcome everyone to Whole Soul Mastery's Live Well, Live Whole podcast series where we focus on mind, body, spirit, wellness, fitness, and wholeness, and bringing awareness to integrating polarity within to spotlight and bring us more into unity consciousness. I'm Marie Mohler, and I'm the author, I'm a channel, and I'm a host of the Whole Soul Mastery podcast series. And I'm here today with Andrew Seaton, who is the author of Spiritual Awakening Made Simple: How to See Through the Mist of the Mind to the Peace of the Here and Now. He is joining us today from Australia, and I want to extend warm welcomes to you, Andrew. I'm so glad, and it's just amazing to be in this conversation with you today.
Thanks, Marie. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here having a chat with you.
Yeah, welcome, truly. And I wanted to share with our listeners just a little bit about who you are, a little bio. For more than 4 decades, Andrew delved deeply into educational philosophy and psychology, old wisdom and new science, reports of higher consciousness, and a wide range of personal development, holistic wellness, and spiritual awareness practices. In 2006, he resigned from a 2-year stint in academia in order to focus on unlearning his education and other conditioning and on awakening the fuller functioning that he had come to see so clearly as possible and desirable. His spiritual awakening began in earnest in September 2018. Andrew is now focused on sharing with adults his practical insights into spiritual awakening. And it is extraordinary. You know, I homeschooled my children for a number of years, and I experienced that same process of the unlearning, the, deconditioning, the unconditioning, and, supporting them to have a greater freedom in exploring who they really are and their natural aptitudes and things like that. So I have some firsthand experience of going through that journey of the unlearning process. And I first just wanted to give you an opportunity to it's always hard to tell, in 2 to 3 minutes or whatever, a little bit about your journey, because we live these vast experiences and the journey is twisty and turny. But if you could share just a little bit with our audience, a little bit about who you are and how you came to write this book, how you came to write the book from that vast sea of experience.
Sorry, can't do it.
I know it, right?
You gave me 2 to 3 minutes. and thank you for reading that little bio. And of course, bio is even the same thing. You could write a bio from 20 different perspectives or more.
True.
But the $64,000 question for every human being actually is, who am I? Who am I really? And you mentioned that I kind of describe how my spiritual awakening began in earnest in 2018, and one experience that kind of was a milestone, as it were, in that was a dream that I had one night. It was a heavenly dream, beautiful dream. I won't go into the details of it, but simply some small groups of men in a theatre, where one by one, these groups were singing to me, "Who are you?" in a cappella, beautiful heavenly harmonies. But this is the $64,000 question: who are you? And of course, this was a milestone in this awakening up to me that I'm not actually anything that I could convey to you in a concept. I'm not anything that I think about who I am. That's not who I am. I'm a formless consciousness, a formless awareness that's beyond the capacity of the mind to define or to label or to describe. And so really that question, of course, we live in the world and we do have an identity that we present in the world. And so things can be said about, you know, what we've experienced in our life and the roles that we're playing and things like that. But it's kind of, I will nevertheless say none of these things that I'm going to tell you now, and I've already broken my 2 to 3 minutes, but I'm going to keep going. None of these things that I'm going to tell you about who I am or what I've experienced are actually anything to do with who I am. And this is what I've realized in my life. Let me just very briefly tell you, you asked the question, well, how did you come to write this book? And it's still not different from the question to, what has your journey been? And in the book, I expressed some misgivings about the word journey, because it takes us out of the present moment into the imagination about past and future, which don't actually exist anywhere except in the imagination. There's really only this moment here presence. But again, it can be just mind games. So let me just say briefly that all my life on 2 trajectories, my personal life, lots of ups and downs. I had a pretty heavy karmic contract to work through. Lots of challenges, personal challenges, relationship, finances, coming to terms with just being in the blooming world and, what kind of work can I do that's meaningful to me and all that sort of stuff. Also, at the same time, my work life, most of it which was in the field of education, never ever made sense to me, really. And I eventually started digging really deeply into, well, what is the nature of learning and what's the nature of knowledge? And there was talk around the turn of the millennium about perhaps we need to be thinking about exploring a different paradigm for the education of human beings, because we used to think of it as being passing on the valuable knowledge, that kids would need to live a successful life. But of course, anyone can go on the internet now and find out blooming just about anything. So what's the role of schooling? Well, this was my professional line of inquiry and efforts to put into practice and to facilitate educational change and so forth. Eventually did a PhD looking at the question of, does it make sense to think about it? A new paradigm for education. And I found, it absolutely does make sense to think about a different paradigm for education, because what I discovered, and even emotion begins to come, or whatever, energy or whatever you want to call it, as I express this, that the way human beings educate our young is not defensible. There is no good theory to justify what we have our children experience. And it's not helpful to them. Yes, on certain, mental and practical levels, we can say, yes, it was good that I learned this at school, or, I was able to become a doctor because I got good grades in school. Yes, we can look at certain things, that advantages from having experienced schooling. But really, deeply, it's not helpful. Why isn't it helpful? Because it strengthens and reinforces a tendency that we all have from the moment we're born into the world, and even prenatally, to begin to identify with form. And schooling in particular encourages and strengthens our tendency for the formless awareness that we are to become mistakenly identified with concepts, with words, with the mind. And so we grow into life in childhood and into adulthood, thinking that we are the thoughts that we have about who we are, which is not at all who we are. And most of them, any particular thought you might have or judgment about yourself that you've ever had, you can probably notice that actually there were times when you thought and felt the opposite of that thing. So they're full of contradictions and grey areas, and it's not who you actually are. So we do our best to think of, I'm going way beyond your question.
No, it's perfect. It's perfect.
But this was the journey I had up to this point. I'm 66, but I feel like it's everything up until now has been preparation. And to get this book out there, and now I feel like my real work is about to really take off. Because there's a desperate need in this world to help people to see the simplicity of finding who they are in their authenticity. And there's actually no need for the complexity, the infinite complexity that we experience as life when we live it through the conceptual mind. The mind loves nothing more than conceptual complexity, conceptual opposites. Everything's debatable, perceivable from a different perspective. And so all of our political debates and so many other debates in different forums in our culture are endless. They'll remain endless while they remain debates of the mind. Because the mind, and here's what I discovered in my deep research into the nature of the mind and the nature of human knowledge and human learning, is that what we like to think of as the knowledge that we have, whether it's, you know, kind of academic formal knowledge or just our personal knowledge of who I am and who you are and what the world is like, it's not a copy of reality. It's not a mirror of reality. It's just a mental construction that's deeply influenced by our individual and our broader, whatever culture we grow up in, by the cultural patterns and ways of perceiving things and interpreting things. And it's not what is. It's just a mental construction of what is. And a very simple and powerful metaphor for that is like the difference between the territory, a geographical territory, say my country, Australia, and I can pick up a paper-based map of my country. Is there a difference between the map and the actual country of Australia? Well, the difference is just incomprehensibly great. Mm. And this is the kind of difference between reality and the conceptual construction of reality that we each have. This is the level of difference between who I am and who I think I am. It's that much difference, like the difference between a paper-based map and the territory that's represented by that paper-based map. And yet we live through life. No wonder we feel frustrated, not fully satisfied with life. Most people die and having never found complete fulfillment. Not to mention all the more dramatic, you know, emotional ups and downs that we go through. And increasingly, you know, depression and loneliness and anxiety and all these things. They're all the result of our continuing to be identified with our mind rather than being able to be the peace-filled, contentment-filled, formless awareness or awakeness that is our real nature, noticing and using thoughts and ideas about me and about the world, but not identified with them. I'm going to stop there, Marie, and let you come in and add something, comment, question, whatever.
That was so fantastic, and there are so many beautiful energies you described, and it is extraordinary that you were able to capture something on the pages of a book to give us a language that puts all these components in the complexity of the concepts that we do live and that we have interacted in for centuries of time and many lifetimes. And we are this essence, this soul presence, this formlessness in form. And yet still, while we're in these bridge times, it helps to have tools and materials and a way to language what we're experiencing when we go on that journey, that spiritual awakening, when we have that inner experience of what you described so well. And, you know, always in Whole Soul Mastery, I spotlight the guides. I'm a channel, I'm an intuitive, and the guides for many years have been telling me that I was going to be part of assisting with the new language. And I think I still don't even know what that means yet, but I do know that we are moving if we're moving from carbon-based to crystalline-based structures in our DNA, if we're changing at the cellular level, we're also changing from conceptual language, which keeps us in boxes in many ways, right? inside our own thinking, trapped inside concepts and the limits of language in that way. And we're moving more into this vibrational language, which I seed in a number of our conversations through sentience. It's things we feel, it's things we experience through our senses. And that presence inside us is always taking in and experiencing those amazing, what it's like to be alive, what it's like to be a human being, a spiritual being in a human form. And like you said, I think we're coming back into a time where more of us are agreeing at soul level in a collective dream to embody that I am presence, to embody that soul essence inside us and that awareness. And yet I do believe in these bridge times, we need a bridge language. And your book is helping people to give that bridge from the conceptual way we live our lives and have conversations and interact, and moving into this expansive vibrational universe that we always were, but we forgot that we were before. We're returning really into a higher form that we were. And so if I can go back a little bit to go forward, it is I just want to say thank you. I thank you for the listeners who will listen to this podcast. I'm grateful for people like you who get that guidance, and it could be, sometimes it's not just an aha moment and then the book obviously manifests the next day. It's a process and you go through that process of, writing these inspired thoughts down, and your goal seems to be to make it simple and accessible to people, to put this large journey and experience into a language and in one place. I don't know how many pages your book is, but it's not that big. Maybe, how many pages?
About 100.
About 100 pages. Isn't that incredible? We can live hundreds or thousands of lifetimes, and you've been able to take the best of a lot of what you've experienced and understood and put that in one place for somebody going through the journey. And journey is some of my language. We'll get into, we talked a little bit before we hopped on camera about the difference between journey and presence. But for me, journey means a movement of energy. So when I think about the word journey, and I talk a lot about the hero's journey in the different podcasts I'm on, I do see this as a helpful tool, like another soul skill that people can have. Because once you start to awaken, it can feel, some people go through aloneness, isolation. They're not speaking the language they always spoke before, but yet they haven't mastered the new language. And it helps people have a sense of confidence as they're stripping off their old costume in the theater of these kinds of changes, and they're having a wardrobe change, right, and a language change. Your work helps to give that, and in quite a complex process, or what it seems to be complex until we distill it down, that it is actually can be simpler when you start to embrace the vibrations and the vibrational journey we're all on. So I wanted to say that when I read, some of the aspects of your book, and I tuned in right away to, of course, the introduction in the first chapter, I resonated how you were distinguishing between spiritual concepts and having a self or soul awareness beyond the conceptual mind. And you were saying in this book that you hope that people will find inspiration and guidance for a more peace-filled, spiritually conscious life. And I quoted you here, I don't use the term spiritually conscious to suggest that you would benefit from being aware of spiritual concepts. There are those who know little or nothing of spiritual concepts and yet are exceptionally spiritually conscious. On the other hand, many people who are very aware of spiritual concepts are quite unconscious, spiritually speaking. That would include most of humanity. I use the term spiritually conscious to refer to an awareness beyond the conceptual mind and beyond thinking. And that there's a lot of energy just in every chapter title, in every topic that you present in this book. There really is a lot of vibrational energy in everything you're saying. If people can allow themselves to feel the living energy in the words you have to use that need to be printed to make a book, right? We do have to still translate those energies. But, I haven't found many people in my journey that are really focusing in on that distinction, that understanding of, and in some recent channelings of my own, there has been this message of we're moving from conceptual understandings of ourselves into more of a vibrationally higher vibrational lived experience. We're changing landscapes in a way, from the concept to vibration, to living more energetically, which can be more holistically, versus living in a contracted state, which concepts in this way in a 3D matrix can be limiting. And so I just didn't know if you wanted to say more about that spiritually conscious life, and what you were really talking about, that difference between concept and living in this greater space inside ourselves.
Yeah, thanks. That's that's beautiful, and it is. It's not just many people, many individuals now who are exploring this different mode of awareness, or different mode of consciousness, and different mode of being in the world. But collectively, it's not going to happen overnight. But humanity is moving into a time when structures and forms will no longer overshadow the formless dimension of life. And the structures and forms that we consider to be who we are, who I am, for example, will no longer overshadow the who I am of any individual. They'll have a sense of who they am that's not limited and constrained by concepts. And we could talk about this, and of necessity here in our interview, we're talking concepts, we're using words, and that's pretty much all we've got to play with here. We may just sneak in a little activity here and there. I'll try and sneak in, but this is what we need to do, and this is what being in the world is. We're dealing with, we're interacting with, and living through the world of form. But when we're aware of what's going on, we can be alert to not allowing the subtlety of reality to be overshadowed by the form that we perceive and that we conceive, that we can perceive around us and that we conceive ourselves to be. So let me just read a couple of sentences from the book at the beginning of the last chapter, where I say to people, well done, if you got this far, good on you, and one of the things I really aspired to do in the book was to give a coherent perspective on what this game of life is about. Some reader described it as, it's like putting all the pieces of the puzzle together and finding that actually they come together quite simply. And that was really what my aspiration was. So at the beginning of the last chapter, I say, up to a point, the mind's need for a viable structure of understanding had to be satisfied. I've sought to paint a picture in broad strokes, as you said, Marie, just 100 pages, and not all of that is even explaining stuff, a lot of that's experiential stuff. I've sought to paint a picture in broad strokes to assist you with this. Now, having discovered and recognized a structure of understanding that hopefully makes sense of it all, you don't want to get further entangled in the mind. From here on, the formula for spiritual awakening is simple. Disbelieving thoughts plus being the noticer equals spiritual awakening. And one of the key methods that I provide for people in the book for experiencing this shift, because you describe beautifully, how we're making this change, many individuals are, and collectively it's just going to be gaining more and more momentum of moving beyond relating to the world through concepts and experiencing ourselves as the awareness that's in the presence, which is deeper than that, beyond that, that observes all of that. One of the key things that I've led the reader to discover is how they can make the shift from being identified with concepts, with words, with definitions of them and the world, and quite simply actually find what lies beneath. And in very brief, right here now, that process involves questioning our thoughts. in a very simple way that I describe and lead people to experience over and over in the book, what we find is, first of all, what troubles us about ourselves and the world out there and people and things is never what we're experiencing. This is one of the amazing things I came to realize, discover. It's not what I experience that ever troubles me. What troubles me is, or triggers my negative emotions, my troubling emotions. What troubles me is when a thought pops up that says, what I'm experiencing is bad, or it shouldn't be that way, or, I don't want it to be that way, or I feel bad, I'm a bad person. When a thought like that pops up and we believe the thought, that's what triggers our troubling emotions. It's not the reality of who I am. It's not what's going on in the world, what I'm experiencing. It's a thought that pops up and says, that's bad, or it's insufficient, it's not good enough, shouldn't be that way. Now, the funny thing is, and the beautiful thing is, that when we look at the thought that's triggered our negative emotion, our troubled emotions, or just our general maybe dissatisfaction with our day or our life, we look at the thought that's underlying that feeling, and we ask ourselves, do I know for certain that that's true? Do I know for certain that it's bad that I've just experienced something? Do I know for certain that it's bad that somebody just said such and such to me? Or do I know for certain that I'm bad because I just blurted out something which somebody felt offended by and they felt hurt by it? Do I know for certain that it's bad? And I never can know for certain. I can see, I show people in the book very simply how you can never know for sure that what all the flow and effects are going to be. And if you ask yourself, is it possible that some of the flow and effects, could be good or could be, thought of as good? Almost always you can quickly say, well, yes, it could, be seen this way, or this could happen as a result of that. And what begins to happen is that the thought crumbles into dust. And when the thought crumbles into dust, the emotion that was triggered by it dissolves. And here's the beautiful thing. What's left when the thought and the emotion dissolve? Who you truly are is what's left.
Right.
Just present, peaceful, contented, not complicated, not wrestling with anything, just the authenticity of you, formless awareness, presence, beautiful. Now, as that happens repeatedly, I show people in the book how to do this and give them lots of tools and encouragements to just use this as a process, not just with the big things that happen in our lives, but even with little things that happen throughout each day. As we continue to this process of disbelieving the thoughts that pop up into our mind and disidentifying from them, realizing that the thoughts themselves aren't even who we are. We tend to think, most people tend to think that they are their thoughts. We kind of live out our thoughts. But actually, I show people in the book how simple it is to begin to notice that there's a thought that popped up. In fact, right now, let's just take a few seconds, and your listeners could right now just pause and ask yourself this question. I wonder what the next thought to pop up in my mind will be. Now, as you do that, after the interview, you might like to do it, just give yourself a little bit longer if necessary. But most people, even just in that few seconds that I gave us then, most people will notice a thought does pop up. But what's fascinating is that they notice that they're there just waiting. What's this thought going to be? And then a thought pops up. So it gives you this very, very simple experience that you are the awareness that notices thoughts. And that puts a distance between you and thoughts. You realize that you are not your thoughts. And this already begins to be quite liberating, because when there's a distance between you and the thought that's coming up, it makes it even easier for there to be a distance between you and any emotion triggered by the thought. You begin to get this gradual awakening and welling up of presence, which in time, and not lifetimes and not decades, but in a fairly short period of time, increasingly becomes your way of being in the world. Peace-filled, interacting, doing the things you need to do, and yet predominantly just experiencing yourself, the predominant reality being this background of peacefulness.
Mm-hmm.
And what's even more precious about that than enjoying the peacefulness of it is that this essence of who we are, this formless awareness, that's the essence of who we are, is the essence of life. It's the formless consciousness that runs the whole show.
Mm-hmm.
And so our life begins to be more satisfying because it becomes an expression of life, not interfered with by the conditioned interpretations and agendas and fears and desires and so forth of the conditioned mind. It's been disidentified from and seen to be not ultimately real. We still have enough of that we can be an individual living in the world, but we're not overshadowed by that anymore. And so our life begins to be an expression of consciousness through our individuality in the world.
Yeah. That was so beautiful, and how you articulate and describe that awareness is, I think I use a similar vibration, but the way I language it is witness observer. So that awareness is the witness observer, the essence of you that's witnessing you having that experience, which some of us could call that the higher self, right? We could call that heart consciousness. We could call that the soul presence. But there is something magical when we also, and I don't know if this is your language, Andrew, but even in recent years, I've really learned this about giving ourselves permission to allow that. It's something that comes into our consciousness that allows us to relax and into the trusting presence inside us, and to have a tool like you just described. There's a part of me that when I began channeling, that was a natural part of the process. But I have to say, I was always kind of a daydreamer. I think people who have that kind of imaginative ability, or that inner artistry in some ways, for some of us, it's a little easier than others to move into that place of awareness. But you having these tools, this exercise, this way of engaging ourselves so we can actually experience the awareness moving through us, especially if we are somebody who's way up in our heads a lot of the time, and may not be that daydreamer, may not be somebody where it was so much easier to witness observe. And there's a lot of people, there's somebody that I listen to in podcasts that's talking a lot right now about the left brain and the right brain, in this way, that left brain that can kind of be a cognitive loop. It's the mental mind, it's the ego trap. It's just, it's always looking to confirm what it thinks it already knows. And you speak to this in the book, right? We're, in many ways, we might even be asking questions, but to have our questions answered in what our expectations are, right? We're actually thinking that we already know in some way, and we're looking to confirm that. And it's almost like we have to get to this new cosmically curious, or this vibrational curiosity, where we're asking this open-ended question and we're allowing ourselves to explore in a different way. And your words provide a bridge. It's beautiful. It's beautiful.
Yeah, well, there's lots that popped into my mind that I want to comment on, and I probably won't be able to remember them all, but just on what you've just been saying.
Yeah.
But one that's there is that anybody can do this. Any of your listeners can awaken to who they truly are, simply. Why can they do that? Because they already are who they really are. Right. That's the beautiful. You talked about the frameworks, the conceptual frameworks we have about things, and in the world of spirituality, the conceptual world, dare I say it, of spirituality, there's so many myths, and so many of them are getting in the way, actually, of our experiencing the essence of who we truly are, because they're setting in mind conceptual frameworks which are kind of, we're trying to jiggle our experience and make it fit what we think is true about spirituality. Forget about what you've ever heard about spirituality and question your thoughts and be who you are. You are already who you are, and so it's simple, and there's nothing could be more natural for you than for you to awake up to this connected mode of consciousness that you are, this peace-filled presence that is your essential nature. You are it now, and it's simple. You don't have to fix anything about yourself. You don't have to develop anything about yourself. You are already this. And I show you in very simple ways in the book how to, even to say experience that is a bit misleading, because if I start talking about experiencing the essence of who I am, well, there's two of me, right? There's me and there's this thing that I'm experiencing. But in the experience of this, in the awakening of this, awakening is a better word because it kind of gets around that duality trap, which is all just part of having to think about it and talk about it with a conceptual mind. In the actuality of it, you're not experiencing something, you are having this beingness, this more essential and more real and more true beingness of your own nature. Now, I want to pick up on another word that you mentioned, Marie, the higher self. Now, so conceptually, we can think of it, I have a higher self. But I want to encourage your listeners to turn that on its head, because the only real you is this higher self, or is this self with a capital S. That is you, and you are already that. You don't need to try and find your higher self. I used to joke with some friends, in the past about this idea of the higher self. Well, now how high is the damn thing? This higher self, and can I ever reach it? You don't never ever need to try and reach the higher self. You are the higher self. It's this other conceptual self-identity. That's the imposter. That's the illusion, or that's the tricky bit. So if you want to think about the various parts of yourself, and there's only one ultimately part of yourself. That's this big S self. That's this higher self. That's the presence, the awareness that is your real nature, the real you. The conceptual, or the self-image, or the self-concept, or the conditioned view or perception of who you are, is not real. Now, as I said before, to some extent, we still need this to be in the world. And I'm Andrew Seaton. I've got a pink shirt on today. And, last year I did this and I went to visit such and such a person. Okay, so I'm this individual in the world of form. And so it's appropriate then to identify me as an individual. We talk about oneness. Okay, we're oneness, but we're also two-ness. We're also multiplicity. The essential reality is the oneness, but we're in the world of form, an expression of oneness as an individuality. And so, yes, it's okay to have certain thoughts about being, I'm this person, and last year I studied this, and, next year I have a plan to do such and such. That's all fine, so long as we don't get identified with those thoughts about who we are and see them as being the primary reality of who we are, because they're not. They're just part of the play of life in this world of form that come and go. They're changeable. They're not ultimately what's real. So don't think of yourself any longer, I would suggest, as having a higher self, and I hope to cultivate it and check in with it more often and this sort of stuff. You are that self. That's the reality of you. If you've got to think of yourself as having these two kind of components, then think of yourself, occasionally I'm noticing that my conditioned self is popping up here and saying such and such. But do it from your orientation, your point of reference being the authentic self that you are. And if there's something else to refer to, it's this conceptual self or my self-image. I can see that there's a habit of thinking of myself in certain ways that's just popping up here. Be the observer of that, rather than being that conditioned notion of yourself, thinking one day I'm going to get aligned with and in harmony with my higher self. No, the higher self's not there. That's you now.
That's such a brilliant thing to distinguish. And again, like you're giving such a language back to all of us. And, wherever we are on the spiritual path, reintegrating with this authentic self, this presence inside us, it helps to have that shift in perception where we are, the awareness, and these other aspects of us are these, whether it's the lower self or the conditioned self or the ego self or whatever, these are the little things that sprinkle through our experience, but we can more and more have that awareness and that witness observer presence inside ourselves that's looking through the lens of that all-knowing beingness that we truly are. And it's extraordinary. And when I was listening to you talk, what came to me, because this is what we do, we pass energy back and forth to each other, is that natural state of buoyancy we're talking about, that natural state of presence and awareness that is the peace and contentment and fulfillment that you describe. And for me, somehow stories are how also the guides speak through me. They just, the mythology through the centuries. And there's the story of the Golden Buddha. Are you familiar with that story?
No, not by name anyway, no.
You would be somebody who should look up that story, but in a nutshell, there was a Golden Buddha, like this amazing statue of a Golden Buddha, essentially. And there was some warfare, and the monks at the monastery realized that they needed to cover up the Golden Buddha because the marauders or whatever were going to be coming and they were going to steal the gold, right? And this was precious to them for the sacredness of it, but they knew it was gold and it could be stolen or whatnot. So they covered it up with clay, and then it got forgotten about. And so no one knew in generations to come that there was a Golden Buddha inside. And at one point years later, a monk is traveling, and I can't remember, but something makes him drop something or something on the statue and it cracks. And of course he's like, but then he realizes there's a Golden Buddha inside. And then there's this excavation of what was always there to begin with, which is such an illustration of what you know and what you've uncovered. You just took away the clay to expose that golden light, that Christ consciousness, that presence inside us that is the awareness that we are all the time. And it's the clay that's transient. And there's this sense of where, we can also use that language that I was bringing in, we're naturally buoyant. And so when you take away the heavy things, the thoughts, the conditions, the vibrational habits that we have that keep us, that hold us down or that keep us away from who we truly are, we naturally rise to be the essence of the shining light that we truly are. And again and again, this theme comes up because people make this, we're conditioned to think in this 3D matrix that everything is hard, with the lack and scarcity and all the hoops you have to jump through in linear life. You need to get this degree, to get this job, to get that mortgage, to have that family, to put kids through college, to, and it goes on and on and on. And these are the clay. These are the rocks that anchor us, in that sea of all those vibrations that aren't really who we really are. And you do such an amazing job of bringing us back to the truth of the essence inside, but you also have some amazing tools in all of that. I wanted to give you a moment if you wanted to respond to that, and then I wanted to ask you another question. So yeah, toss it back to you.
Thank you, Marie. And it is lovely having this exchange because, as you say, it's a lovely energy exchange, and one thought prompts another one. And the beautiful thing about the thoughts that we are having and discussing is that they're not on the level of thoughts. They're thoughts that are pointing to something that's so much more precious and beautiful. So the first thing I want to pick up on is your use of the word sacred. And I want to say to all your listeners, don't ever get tricked into identifying with things in the world around you as being sacred. They're not what's sacred. You are what's sacred. You don't need to add anything sacred to you. You don't need to put anything on your wall to be, I'm going to look to this thing as being sacred. It's a pale shadow of sacredness compared with what you are. And people have said in the past, sacredness is within you. The kingdom of God is within you. And then people have told stories about these people, and they've said, look, here's a sacred place where this person spoke, and here's a sacred place where we've written about some of the things that they said. And we get so distracted and tricked into running around here and there, trying to find, how can I add some sacredness to my life, and how can I be reverent towards those things that are sacred? And it's such an endless merry-go-round. You are what is sacred. You don't need to go anywhere. You don't need to do anything. You don't need to earn anything or deserve anything. It's all there, you. Now, the other thing, Marie, I want to pick up on what you said, I just can't remember the exact word, but it was about some sort of quality of feeling. I can't remember exactly what.
Buoyancy?
Yes, thank you. That was it. Now, here's what I wanted to say about that. When I talk about the essence of you as being, and the essence of me as being this formless awareness, it is formless in the sense that it's more subtle than the mind and the body. But it's not absolutely formless. It has qualities. They're very subtle, and we don't want to go into defining them and categorizing them and listing them too much, because then we're inviting the mind in and we lose those qualities that we're feeling are so precious.
Right? Yes.
But one of those qualities of presence, of the essence of who I am, is buoyancy. One of those qualities that might bubble up a little bit more as a different flavor sometimes might be contentedness. Another one might be lovingness. Another one might be playfulness. And these are who you are. They're who I am. And what you might be noticing, some of your listeners, Marie, might be noticing, these are the qualities that we often say are characteristic of little children.
Yes. I was just feeling that when you were talking, the inner child, right?
Yeah. They are characteristic of little children, because little children in the main have not yet put a blanket over that through the conditioning that they've taken on. They haven't lost that, but they gradually do, sooner or later, some sooner, some later, and we begin to experience life very differently, and we lose touch in varying degrees, but most people, a lot, we lose touch with those very subtle qualities of life and who we are. But they don't ever get ultimately lost, because they are who we are. Again, just to give a caution around conceptualizing, and again, we're here using concepts, and they can be helpful, but we just want to be so cautious that they don't become a tyrant at the same, inadvertently. So this notion of the inner child, I would say to your listeners, just be cautious not to segment a part of yourself and think of it as being, here's my inner child here, and I'm going to have a talk with my inner child and encourage him to come forward and be over here. All this is conceptual stuff. All this is really mind games, because the essence of you is wholeness, oneness, beyond categorizing and chopping and dicing. So there is no inner child actually as a separate entity, as it were. There's these qualities that are childlike, but they're not lost. They are who you are. We just notice them more in our childhood, and we notice them more in children around us than we tend to in our everyday life. But those beautiful qualities are part of the essence of who we are. So again, we could say that's me, rather than that's this defined categorization or conceptualized part of me. There's only one you. And even this notion we touched on before quite a few times, I suppose, the notion of a conceptual identity or a self-image or an egoic sense of self. It ultimately is not a separate entity. It often seems like that, it often feels like that, often seems to be functioning like that, but ultimately it isn't an entity. There's only one entity, and that's you.
It's so beautiful. Like when you live at this level of vibration, when you live at this level of awareness, it's like a song. I had a podcast with another friend of mine for Mastery. Renee Tainter and I spoke about some of my transmissions that flow through from the guides. And, we're all connected in the oneness. And she was asking questions to understand. And she was asking questions that other people are thinking when they receive the transmissions. They sometimes want to understand and want to unpack it in some way. And what's interesting is we never got beyond the first sentence of the transmission in our podcast, because in that very first sentence, there was so much vibration that, and that's what I felt called to share with her, is that when you experience a transmission like the kind that I can bring through, it's an energy to be experienced. It's you, and it's just mirroring to you who you are. But it's not that we have to understand all the words that they gave to us, and the words can limit us basically, or they can liberate us. But there's this movement into experiencing the energy more and analyzing, of course, letting go the analysis of the way they came through, but just, and I said, listen to the transmissions as if it were a song. Because when you hear a song for the first time, at least I don't hear the song the first time and try and memorize every word and lyric and melody about it. I just experience the song the first time. And I think in some ways that's what you're describing, is this, I use the word experience. I'm sure even that has its limits, but in that bridge language kind of way of allowing ourselves to be an essence that's drinking in the energy of something in form, experience probably comes the closest to that while we are the form and the formless at this time. And I wonder if you resonate with that, or if that somehow feels off, but that feeling of that essence, that experience of exchanges like this as a song, as a communication, as a connection, as a vibration. For many people, that's challenging. That is challenging. And yet when you language it and you explain it, you invite us into that space of the inner child, that witness observer, that awareness having the experience. And I think it's masterful, really. And I'm somebody that for many years has gotten messages about the inner child. And when we do play and when we do create, and you see little kids on the beach, or you see kids, they're in reality, whatever they're making, right? And I use this example, but if they're playing with mud, or they're playing with sand or whatever, or they use Legos and they put it together and say, I made a pizza, for them, they're in the total enjoyment of all the experiences they had, and they're delighted with themselves. That inner delight is a frequency.
Yeah.
And it's been so conditioned out of us through the use of language that can limit us, and that it does. Kindergarten or first grade, second grade. I don't know if that's how you language education in Australia, but we have kindergarten, first grade, second grade here, and onwards up, to college. But very quickly you learn how to sit down and receive instructions, and you're being trained. Essentially, I know this goes out on a limb here for some listeners, but we are being trained to enter the workforce as early as 4 or 5 years of age. And we started this a little bit talking about the education system, because that's some of your background, and it was some of my experience, because I ended up also homeschooling some of my kids for a number of years. And so, witnessing that, it was amazing how there are some schools that are still about that playfulness and the movement of energy. I don't know if you know about the Emerson, Waldorf, and Rudolf Steiner. I'm sure we can get into the language of that, but even that was bridging some of that, at least I remember, with colors and movement, and a little more so than standard public school. And so you can see how, and this is the world of duality, if we're just talking about ourselves in form, how even through language and conditioning, we can go into a world of limits, or we can allow those limits, witness those limits. And now as adults, especially if there were kids listening to this, if they were teenagers, it would be fabulous, because I think we're all looking to liberate ourselves and move in energy and vibration and allow that inner child to emerge. And when you wrote this, I don't know, do you feel like were you the essence of your inner child, or was your analytical self fully present too?
Gee, Marie, you always give me so much that I would love to comment on. So let's start with the last bit. In the preface of the book, I relate how early in 2018, because for a couple of years I felt I want to write this book. In the beginning of 2018, I thought, oh gosh, I would really like to try and start writing this book, you know, and I didn't I had a few sort of messages and hints that it wasn't quite right time, but I thought, no, I'm going to try, you know. So I wrote down some key things I wanted to say on different sheets of paper and lay them out on a table, and nothing would come, you know. And I just couldn't write it. I could have forced it with
Yes.
my mind, but I felt, oh gosh, no, it's just not flowing. So I put it away, and I thought, well, maybe later, you know. And it was about a year later, early January 2019, I came across a list on the internet. I came across a list of things most people learn too late in life. And I read this list and I thought, oh, that's lame, you know, that's so cliched and it doesn't get to the heart of it at all, you know. And I thought, oh, God damn it, there's a need for this book that's in me, you know. And so I thought, oh yeah, well, maybe, but I'm still not really ready, and you know, it's not time yet. I'll just be patient. But then I had dreams and messages that said, no, write it now. And I began writing, and I was amazed at how the content just was coming to me. And, you know, often I would go on my usual hour-long walk in the morning, and I'd be out a couple of kilometers away from home, and then I'd have to try and find a shortcut back home because I had 3 ideas that had popped into my mind, you know, that I didn't want to forget about. And I raced at home, scribbled them back down and started writing again, you know. So it really just came. Now, it didn't come as, in my case, channeling. It came, I would say, use the words intuitive inspiration. But of course, I used my mind also. My experiences, related quite a few anecdotes about my experience, drew on some stuff I'd written before, and I drew on a lot of what I'd come to understand in the past. Yes, pulled it all together, but it was coming in a formulation that was far more powerful and beautiful than I could have managed to do with just my mind. So it was a lovely experience, and it's resulted in, that's why sometimes I say to people, you can forgive me for saying that this is a beautiful book and it's just precious and profound, because I didn't write it, in a sense, you know. It's just not out of Andrew Seaton, the self-concept kind of person, didn't put this together. No, it's something that came from something deeper within me, let's just say that. But look, so much of what you said, Marie, you know, we could talk for hours, because as I have said, my background was in education. I always saw it as a big mistake, really, put it in the briefest terms. And I left a university teaching job in 2006, where I'd been given a lovely brief. You know, my designation was really to talk about what they were defining. As a few prominent people were talking about new learning and new teaching. So it was right down my alley, and I'd just finished my PhD looking at educational paradigm of that change. But it's pretty soon in that job, I began to see that I was whistling in the wind, really, you know, and I chucked it. Could have had a career in academia, but that's not what I came to this planet for.
Wow.
You know, I said, no. So I gave it away, and I went and lived off grid on a hobby farm for 3 or 4 or 5 years. And this really helped me to get out of my head. You talked earlier about being in your head. Well, I was very much in my head in my earlier adult life. And partly it was a kind of a coping mechanism. I always felt very deeply, and you know, it was safer to be in my head than to be in my feelings, and all of that. There's a whole lot more that could be said about that too. But what I want to say is, a couple of years after I'd left academia and I'd been on the farm, and it started to really get me out of my head, because I'd have a plan for what I wanted to do tomorrow, and then tomorrow would come and the blooming cow would be out in the neighbour's paddock, and I had to go and do what nature was telling me and needed to be attended to, not what my mind was saying. No, this is my policy, this is what needs to be done. No, this is what reality is telling you needs to be done. And so this really helped to shift this rigidity of my mind, you know, my makeup and way of functioning. But a couple of years after I'd been on the farm, I wrote a book called Deep Intelligence, Giving Our Young the Education They Really Need
Wow.
Now, I self-published it. I didn't know anything about it and didn't somehow feel the energy to go and market it. It was out there, properly published, but not distributed. You know, it was self-published and blah, blah. And I just didn't feel it was time. And now that I've written this book, Spiritual Awakening Made Simple,
Yes.
I'm feeling this is why, because this book had to come first. And if any of your listeners are parents and they're kind of interested in what they can do to help their children to take on as little as possible of the conditioning that life of necessity does subject them to, I would say grab this book, because even in that book that I did write about education, or what a parent can do to help with their child's education, that's really what it was about. And why institutions never will be able to give our children the education they need, despite in many cases, in most cases even, the very highest motives of teachers. No, it can't be done in an institution. But the starting point for any parent with an interest in what they can do for their children is to learn to be as present as you possibly can, to be as much as possibly you can your authentic self. So Spiritual Awakening Made Simple is the best starting point anyway. And when I write this, I'm about to rewrite that book I wrote 10 years ago. It's my next book. It'll have a slightly different title, I'm not sure just yet, but it'll be a book for parents about what they can do to help to raise their child, educate. I'm not sure whether I'm going to use the word raise or educate, or neither sort of fits very well, but parents inevitably have a tremendous amount of influence, of course, on how their child grows up to function and operate in the world. And so I want to show them some of the things that they can do and not do. But the starting point, of course, is going to be, I'm going to say, if you haven't read this book, Spiritual Awakening Made Simple, that's got to be your starting point. Because not only then will you be able to be more sensitive and effective in the way that you implement some of the suggestions that I might give you, but even more important than that, you are yourself going to know what your child needs to hear or to experience or to be invited or whatever, because this will arise from within you as life. It'll come.
It's beautiful. And of course, many things came up in me, but just right off that last thread, it's a lot like I've seen videos of Simon Sinek's. I don't know if you've ever seen him, The Power of Why, in his videos, but he's talking about all these corporations, and the ones that are successful know why. It's like the essence of why they do what they do. And it's not it's not a goal. It's not a thing. It's not something outside them. It's the formless. It's that vibrational anchor card from which everything flows. And in a way, what you're talking about is, the spiritual awakening made simple is that vibrational anchor card that gives parents that essence of the why. And then the other thing I felt with your other book, that I can't remember its title, but I can feel its essence. It empowers parents to facilitate inner child sustainability. We're looking to sustain the essence that does it's born, it is here, and then it's conditioned, or there's a separation energies put in between, and then it feels harder and harder to hold on to that in a world, it's harder and harder to hold on to that essence inside us when the world around us is mirroring all these other things and expectations of what we're supposed to be. And I think, obviously with the changes in the world right now, the earth shifts, the consciousness that's changing, the collective moving into this, releasing more and more of the dream of separation, and more coming together of this dream of reunion with this essence, with our divinity, with the light and the aspects of a source that we truly are. I think there is this renaissance of education, and I don't necessarily like that word either, but that cultivation of making space. That's what I saw homeschooling as in my life, is that making room for my kids to explore who they are. That's in essence what we did. And I have two older boys in conservatory schools right now, but they discovered, because they had time in their day to play. They had time in their day to explore, and naturally things came into their experience. Some they resonated with and some they didn't. But because they had just time in nature and time with themselves, time. When they had time to be present in this world, they could explore that. My daughter's the same. You know, a lot of exploration of the arts and her interests. And, you know, just like dress up in a way of like trying some things on. Do I like this? Do I not like this? Do I resonate? Does this feel like it's me? And, you know, we had the whole buffet of all kinds of things that they could try on. And your work, that book that you are going to rediscover and really look at, you know, and probably upgrade it with your insights over the last 10 years too, right? But I think it's a supportive resource for parents who, it takes courage, like what you said, it took courage to step away from that university job. We all know that there was the promise of some kind of perceived security or status or identity or all of those things wrapped up together. And a lot of people don't know how to go off grid. They don't know how to take the next steps. But as the landscape on this planet, this vibrational landscape is changing, and the structures that supported foundations of separation at any level are crumbling, because as people wake up from the dream and they allow this presence inside them, they're seeing differently, they're perceiving differently, they're languaging differently, they're showing up differently inside themselves. They're saying, wait, you know, and what was previously just the norm, it was the convention, it was what everybody does. More and more people are saying, that's not right for me. That cubicle is not feeding my spirit. That even a job that might have a lot of freedom, but you're on the road 360 days a year. For some people, they're starting to say, ask those questions. Is this for me? And I guess maybe there's a lot said there, but also there's this curiosity to know, who am I? Which was the initial dream you described in this conversation today that showed up, where these singers were singing a cappella in the dream. Essentially, who are you? There is this invitation right now inside all of us, wherever we are in that spiritual awakening process, to get super, like, delightfully curious about ourselves. When you were with that cow on that farm, there's the invitation to like really get curious about what you need to be dealing with in the moment, in the natural elements of whatever that circumstance was, versus thinking your way through the whole thing. You know what I mean? And I think we are throwing that off. And then this is a whole other conversation, but you can see when you're in alignment inside yourself with that presence. Let me go back up. If we're in the third dimensional version of ourselves, where we're in our ego minds and we're on that loop and we're having to figure everything out and understand everything and take all the linear steps, we're working hard. But when we're in our presence, when we're in that vibrational essence of the witness observer, the awareness, the light that we are, everything that we need shows up for us. And what was so hard, and just like you said, you wrote the book. When you tried to write it, it seemed hard. It's like, I want to say, constipated creativity. There was kind of like, you know, and it just has its grip on it. But when you let go and everything relaxes, it just comes through. And I found that way, that rolling into manifestation, like things that are meant for me flow through me. And I don't have to do the orchestrating. I'm just the essence celebrating the experience. And I think that's ultimately what you're inviting people into, that peace and that joy and that delight and that inner child, if we would allow ourselves to have it. There's a lot of energy in there, but I celebrate the work, the joy of what you've brought through for people. But where the two aspects of us are right and left hemispheres of our brain, and the duality inside us, however that shows up, can be satiated in a work like this, because you're supporting that presence inside us as the formed part of ourselves that still needs some language and some steps and some examples of how to embrace the living of that. You bring it together. You bring the duality game together in this book, really.
Yeah, well, thank you. And that was my hope. Yeah.
You do.
The thing I was very glad to eventually be able to get in the title of this book, after all my such long searching and investigating and trying out this and trying out that organization and looking into this philosophy, and it was all so complicated and so many dead ends, so many disappointments, you know, so many quagmires I got stuck in and all of that. But what I eventually found was it's simple. It's simple. What makes it complicated? What makes life complicated? The mind. But you are not your mind.
No.
The truth and beauty of life is simple.
Yeah.
And simple to realize. This is not another concept. Oh, now I have the concept that life's simple.
Right. But
No,
if you could drink in simple as a song, if you can drink in simple as an experience, as an awareness, then you're on.
I'll go with your last word, awareness, because you know there are. I agree to some extent with what you said about song, and I had in my book that no longer exists about educating a child, deep intelligence. I made some comments about how great art, for example, can really take us out of our thinking mind. Somebody recently said, what about the experience of awe? And I thought, yeah, that's great too, because awe is this, say you're in nature and you see this magnificent scene of nature, and it just takes you into this sense of awe. Now, the sense of awe, I realized when this person mentioned it to me, it's an experience, inverted commas, we're going to use that word experience, of being in something that the mind cannot fathom and the mind could not convey to anybody else. And yet it's so much more real feeling than anything that we usually normally experience. Yeah. Well, this is beautiful. This is the essence of who we are. That's why nature can often, not every aspect of nature, but often we'll have an experience in nature where it just draws us out of our mind into somehow the arising of this essence of who we are, which is, of course, also the essence of what orchestrates all of the manifestation of nature. Beautiful art can help to bring that about. Usually it's fairly momentary, even like most experiences of awe are quite momentary. Yeah. Even humor, and I give some brief discussion and a few examples of humor in my book, it can crack this rigidity of the mind, and it subverts the authority of our ideas. We start to see in a joke, which brings kind of two contexts together, they clash, and suddenly we just burst out laughing. The tension is dissolved. The tension built into these conditioned perspectives on things dissolves, and we realize that actually they were just mental constructions after all, and they just fall into dust. So these various things can be nice tools, most enjoyable experiences, usually, as I say, fairly momentary, but lovely nevertheless. And what I've tried to do in my book, Spiritual Awakening Made Simple, is give some tools that can make the realization of that level of your awareness or presence something that you can tap into very quickly. Now, we're breaking a habit, and I explain in the book how ultimately all that we're doing here in Spiritual Awakening is breaking a habit. We're breaking a habit of identifying with form, identifying with concepts, thinking that that's real and that's who I am. Now, habits by their very nature are repetitive, they're cyclical. So when we question a pattern and we enjoy the peace that results and the presence that results from questioning a thought, for example, or seeing through an emotion and what triggered it, and it just dissolves, and then we're lovely, present, peaceful, contented. That pattern of perception and thinking most likely is going to get tested again, and it'll pop up again, and then each time we question it, see through it, and it dissolves, it weakens and weakens and weakens. And in this way, we increasingly experience our life from, as I said earlier, from this different dimension of beingness than what we've been used to. But with these little tools that I offer the reader, it only takes actually seconds
Mm.
Step out of what you're experiencing, what you're thinking about, troubled by, what emotion you're caught up in. It only takes seconds to come back to the peaceful presence that is you, the formless awareness. So I want to just throw that in there here as we're probably coming close to the end, that it doesn't have to just be once every 3 years I'm out in nature camping, for example, and I have this beautiful experience of the awesomeness of nature, and it reminds me of it. It doesn't have to be so seldom. No, it's quite simple actually, when you've got the little simple tools to cultivate your life and live it and come back to the authenticity of who you are in a few seconds.
Thank you. I mean, that was so beautiful. And it's so accessible. It's already within us. We're just learning that art of allowing, really, in this process of spiritual awakening. And, many of my listeners, on many of these podcasts and in my transmissions, the guides always come through talking about conscious breathing. And it doesn't have to be this big meditation, or I have to take 10 classes to master whatever that is. There really is this moment of presence inside ourselves where we're just literally allowing ourselves to be in the enjoyment of taking a conscious breath inside. And it resets us in the allowance of what we already are. And your book, the masterful way in which you've shared this in these accessible tools that really don't take much time, and in fact they invite us inside ourselves, almost a step outside of time for just a moment, right? And that's the beauty. So thank you. I want to thank you. I'm going to have you back. We'll have more conversations about this. Where can people find out more about you and your book online?
Thanks, Marie. Well, the book's everywhere. It's on Amazon, most online bookstores. You can get it as an ebook, but I would urge your listeners to consider buying the paperback, because I recommend in the book that you use this as a manual for your awakening, not just as something to read once. Oh, that was interesting, I'll do this aspect of that. No. Read it over and over, and you'll find it'll work that onion trick, layer by layer by layer, you'll just become deeper and deeper into your own presence. So it'll be helpful to you, I would think, to have the physical copy. It's also in many bookstores. And if people would like to check out a little bit about feedback that's come through so far on the book, and about one-on-one mentoring and counseling that I offer, I've got a website, awakeningmadesimple.org. awakeningmadesimple.org. There's also a newsletter there people could subscribe to if they wish, and some of my social media links are in the contact page. Would love to hear from people.
Perfect. Well, thank you for that. And I'll be sure to include that in the description section below. And I just thank our audience, thank our listeners for sharing this video with anybody you think would benefit and resonate with these messages. You can find us at Whole Soul Mastery on YouTube, and you can also find us at wholesoulmastery.com. And until next time, blessings, everyone. Thank you for joining us today.